Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome. We look forward to hearing more about David Gehring's book today. And I'm Amanda Perry. I'm the executive director for the NACBS. I am just going to briefly introduce our guest today, and then I'm going to turn it over to David to get started. So, David Gehring is associate professor in early modern history at the University of Nottingham. He received his BS in history and economics before earning the MA and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. David has been a research fellow at higher education institutions like Warwick, Durham, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as at elite archives such as the Huntington Library, Newberry Library, Folger Shakespeare Library, and the Herzog August Bibliothek. His book, A European Elizabethan, The Life of Robert Beale, Esquire, which we'll be hearing more about today, was published in 2024 by Oxford University Press. And so he'll be joined today in conversation by Lucy Kaufman, who is Associate Professor of British History at the University of Alabama, the author of A People's Reformation, Building the English Church in the Elizabethan Parish. And she has also written numerous articles and chapters, including the forthcoming chapter on religious cultures in the New Cambridge History of Britain. Lucy received her PhD from Yale in 2014, where her dissertation won the university-wide Field Prize, and she has held posts at Clark University and the University of Oxford, and she was recently elected Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. So I hope you all will join me in welcoming David, and I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for the opportunity here this evening for me, afternoon for some of you, and morning for still others of you. And it brings me, as it does for just about a lot of people when you finish a book, it brings me an enormous amount of joy, satisfaction, and relief to hold it in my hands. And this book was, at least by way of my own measure, a long time coming. And I, as a work on one particular person, Robert Beale, I first actually met, if I can say, met Robert Beale in an archive in Germany, in the Staatsarchiv Marburg, in 2008 when I was doing research for my doctoral dissertation. I was looking at foreign policy, diplomacy, and he was an ambassador, an English ambassador, going around Germany in 1577. And I had begun to think over the course of my doctoral work that that Beale was in some ways a microcosm or a register for something much bigger than himself in the second half of the 16th century. But as any doctoral student either knows or is told by their supervisor, you need to keep your eyes on the prize and actually finish the dissertation. And so I needed to put Beale on the back burner, so to speak. Nevertheless, I knew that he was somebody I would probably want to come back to after the PhD was done, first book done, and so in my second book, which is actually an edition for the Camden series, Royal Historical Society's Camden series, I edited one of his pieces on the state of Germany, and so I started getting more and more into his own writing, his own research, Beale's own research, his own early biography, let's say, in the 1560s, and then that project reinforced my previous notion that he was a microcosm, or he could be seen anyway, as a microcosm or register of bigger developments in not just in European foreign policy, but also in European identities during the wars of religion and how migration might factor into those identities. And so the genesis of the book is really going back quite some time, but I really only started in earnest working on the book in, say, 2016 or so. So it's been something like 7, 8 years for this one, and fairly early on, so it was probably something like 2016, 17, I was chatting with we'll just say an unnamed but very, very senior historian in the field. And I said, well, I'm thinking about writing a book about Beale. And this person said, well, how long do you have? And I said, well, I don't want to be writing. I don't want to be writing a biography for the rest of my career. But he said, well, anyone could write a biography in 2 years, 3 years. Anyone could do a biography of Beale in 2 or 3 years, but it wouldn't do it justice. So if you're going to do it right. And so, all right, okay. So I decided to cook it low and slow, so to speak, rather than try to speed things up. And so naturally a pandemic got in the way. And so archival work was, it needed to shift in different ways. And so the archival work for me was in parts online, as it has been for lots of us, but then also in situ. And so I traveled quite a bit to work with Beale's own archive, or what's the core of which is still in the British Library, but then also it's a matter of tracking down stray materials this way and that. And actually the strays, that was actually the most fun stuff, I thought. Trying to find that material that was in either regional archives, regional public archives, or in private hands. And so the archival hunt, I suppose, was part of what kept me going. And oftentimes we might come to a point where we're really looking for some degree of justification to keep us going on a really long project. But the hunt in the archives, that's what kept me going. And actually one maybe nice example is on the very cover of the book. That seal, the RB seal, is, of the hundreds, thousands of materials I've seen, that's the only one that actually has his seal intact. And it is at Belvoir Castle, the home of the Duke of Rutland, actually not far from Nottingham here. And so when I saw that at Belvoir Castle, my heart leapt. I had that super geek moment where it's like, oh my goodness gracious, a real seal and it's intact. And I thought immediately, that's the cover of the book, as long as His Grace the Duke would allow it, and thankfully he did. But so the surprises were kept me going. Little glimpses into his private life were fun to see. Gifts that he received in some ways. Moments of when he was a victim of pirates, for the sake of example, in the late 1570s. Seeing glimpses into his family life and seeing how his relationship with his wife, Edith, could be seen in his archive. Never explicitly, but only implicitly around the corner, as it were. And his many, many, many children, not all of whom survive, as Lucy certainly knows. And so the genesis, the process, the surprises have actually been fun. I don't know if a second monograph is supposed to be fun, but this one definitely was for me, and I think it can probably be seen on at least 2 levels, and one is that way in which he's representative of much bigger trends in the wars of religion, and the identities of those who were pushed from their homelands, but then pulled themselves back, but then retained an international sense of identity, while nevertheless being very much an Englishman in a certain regard. And I think that push and pull of identity can happen in probably any age, most certainly our own, most certainly within the United Kingdom and Europe more broadly now. But I think that there's a particular moment in the second half of the 16th century during the wars of religion, during periods of mass migration, that we can see how religious ideologies really, really do inform political sensibilities, how they inform personal lives, correspondence networks, and otherwise. And so I've really tried to think about how Beale maps onto the Reformation itself. How is he emblematic of the Reformation? How is he emblematic of those who come from outside the aristocracy, outside a land of privilege, but somebody who, through his own motivation, a bit of patronage along the way, no doubt about it, but through a lot of his own learning, through a lot of his own hard graft, we might say, could climb his way into Elizabethan government, serve as an MP on a number of occasions. But nevertheless, no matter how high he climbed, he was always bitterly insecure, like just woefully insecure. Until the month he dies, he knows how insecure he is. And it's actually quite painful to read his correspondence in the last year and a half of his life. And then after he dies, the correspondence that carries on. And so seeing how he's representative of bigger and broader trends, whether it's socially or whether it's religiously or politically, internationally, I think that's all very, very important at a macro level. But I think the meaning, at least for me, as I would like to think of myself as a professional historian, has been probably at the lower level, at the micro level. And I hope anyway, that in this respect, this project has actually made me a better historian. It certainly made me a different one, to say the least, because working on the level of one person and their immediate surroundings, so call it biography and surroundings, has made everything very, very intimate, very real, very close. I felt more of an imperative to get it right, to do it justice. I think that my previous work on foreign policy or on print or on publications, whatever, if you don't quite get something right at the macro level, that's okay, that's bad. Okay, we should always try to get our stuff right. But if you're working at the level of one person, I felt more of a responsibility to do that person's family, those people, to do them justice. And so I think there was a greater degree of responsibility, a greater weight on my shoulders. And I think the more I got into the chapters, the more I got into the process, the more I read of his stuff, of his correspondence, either written by him or that sent to him, his own treatises, the more I felt that weight, and the more I was utterly convinced that I needed to take a long time to do this. And I didn't want to rush it. And when ultimately I sent the proposal to OUP, I pitched a certain number of words, and I said, okay, it's going to be 125 to 130, 125,000 words, something like that. And the readers came back and they said, well, we want more. Like, no, you need to say more about this, more about that, more about this. And so when I asked the editor, I said, well, they want more. Like, what can I do? The editor said, well, how much do you want? I said, can I get $1.50? Can I get 150,000 words? And he said, go for it. So it just gave me time. Now it turned out to be 146, so it came under that 150 threshold. But Uh, I think that, just in the interest of maybe wrapping things up here, I think that from the genesis through the process, the fun little surprises, the meaning of this book, hopefully for the profession, is that unknown unknown, if I can use such a phrase, has now been answered in Beale. Somebody who um, Elizabethan historians, or historians rather of Elizabethan England and 16th century Europe, we've all known about Beale for a long time. He's one of these figures who's always in the background, always has his fingers in the pies, but in the words of Patrick Collinson, no one had dared to write a biography of Beale. Apparently, I was that precocious little jerk who tried, and so hopefully, I've then been able to provide that service to the academy, to you folks. But I certainly know that this project has changed me, and like I say, hopefully for the better. But I'll leave that maybe to others to judge. Moving on, but Lucy, over to you, and I must say. I am enormously grateful to Lucy Kaufman for agreeing to not only to offer a comment, but actually to read the whole thing. I mean, most of the times we cherry pick our books these days. Just check out the index and ooh, what's this part? What's this part? You actually read the whole thing.
Cover to cover.
My
Yeah.
goodness.
Yeah. No, well, thank you so much, David. It was a real joy actually to have this opportunity to do this. This is something that, you as somebody who is, as I think is probably true for most of us, always torn in multiple directions with our own work and multiple projects and teaching and administration. The opportunity to really sit down, to feel a little bit like a graduate student again in some ways, to just really sit down and tear a book apart and read it in that kind of slow, deep, thick way that you don't necessarily have time for as a historian was actually a gift I didn't know I needed. And so in a weird way, reading about Beale and his meticulousness has prompted something in me that I didn't expect. And I was delighted for another reason, which David doesn't actually know. I first came across Beale when I was coming to history for the first time, kind of as a quasi-adult, during my master's degree. I actually ended up doing my MPhil at Cambridge, and I wrote my master's thesis on the three articles and the controversy around the three articles. And so in one of my first sort of to patronize myself, sort of big girl research trips, right? I went to the British Library and sat down with the archives and opened up Beale's commentary on the three articles and some of the things that were going on there. And so Beale, for me, unbeknownst to me really, until I read this book, has been kind of a backdrop to my own research over time. And I think one of the things that David points out, and one of the great gifts of this book, is that I think that's probably true for a lot of us in ways that we might not have expected or understood until we read this book. This book is, at its core, a kind of revivification of a hidden figure, of a lost figure. Now, I want to be really clear. I am at my heart like an old-fashioned social historian. When most of my hidden figures exist in one line in a court document in a random local archive, and that's the only time you will ever hear about their life. And I feel sometimes this sense of enormous guilt. And I hear when David's talking about this with my own people, because usually the people who I'm dealing with, I only have a record of the absolute worst day of their life. The day that they're hauled before the church courts to talk about the fact they've had a illegitimate child with somebody and they have to apologize, something like that, right? So I feel like I'm reviving them to the historical imagination only in the thing that must have been one of the most humiliating or sort of traumatic moments of their life, and I sort of show it to everyone and then flee in another direction. So it's actually kind of wonderful to have an opportunity to talk about somebody who is simultaneously both knowable and unknown. And again, like David, I end up quoting Donald Rumsfeld a lot more than I ever thought I would. It's the known unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns, right? And so for some ways, he is interestingly not an unknown unknown, but I didn't realize how much I didn't know about him. And I didn't realize how central he was. And you make some convincing points, I have to say, throughout that really center Beale not just as a notable notary, not just as somebody who can and does create an archive and is useful, but someone who's really shaping and directing international policy in some really fundamental ways, not just for the English government, but also for foreign actors who are who are commissioning him to write white papers or asking his opinions on things. This sort of almost invisible hand that's shaping a lot of things and making connections between things I didn't necessarily expect. So what I want to do here is I'm not going to re-encapsulate the entire book for all of you. I assume that you are all either going to read it or have read it, but I just want to point out a couple things that I thought were interesting and then ask some bigger questions for David and give him an opportunity to reflect before we open the floor to everybody. If at the risk of making David embarrassed by praising him to his face, I do want to say that one of the things that I was most struck by was the just sheer volume of meticulous research that went into this, which is really exceptional. I counted 36 separate archives that at minimum, and multiple collections within it. The ability to piece these things together. There were moments when one archive was checked against another, which was checked against a third, which was able to triangulate a truth, which is something that you can only do when you have a at the risk of seeming damning, and this really isn't, sort of almost an Eltonian reaction to the archive, like the knowing, sort of the instinct that you get by knowing your archive so well, where you can almost start to predict patterns or know when something's missing or be able to fit these things together. And that is a kind of history that takes time. It does take slow cooking and is not possible, I think, in some ways with the focus on just sheer productivity and the churn that happens, but is so valuable and is something that I particularly am taking to heart. And for me, also, it's really interesting that Beale is such an almost sort of quasi-lost figure, a name that probably many of us who are Elizabethan historians know and may know well, but we don't know the whole picture. We don't know the whole story in the way that we would people with whom he was incredibly close, right? Even my students sort of have heard of Cecil or have heard of Dudley or have heard of Walsingham, right? His brother-in-law. He's so close to so many of these figures. And while of course he's not as romantic a figure as Dudley might be, or as important a figure as Cecil, I mean, he's not that far off Walsingham in terms of his importance and centrality. So I've been thinking a lot about why he remains somewhat unknown to me. And I think, interestingly, one of the things that this book speaks to is this period as a fundamental hinge. A person like Beale, no matter how important he was to central policy, I would argue if you were writing about Beale in 1475, you couldn't have written this book because he would have been largely invisible to the record in so many ways, right? There are princes and queens that we don't have details about their lives in any fundamental way, shape, or form who were born 50 years before Beale, 60 years before Beale. And if you were born 50 or 60 years later, the mania for archives, the mania for administration, the mania for writing things down and for keeping these things, I think would make him even more legible to us. I think if Beale were a product, somebody who was born in 1640, not 1540, 1541, we would know so much more about him. He would feel so much more central. So many more things would be legible to us about his early life. There would be fewer sort of mists of time. And so for an interesting reason, he felt just like a classic Elizabethan to me, right at this hinge moment as a historian between the knowable and the unknowable. And for me, as reflecting upon this, was actually one of the most fun things for this. And then obviously there are these big questions that are raised, big questions about the Reformation, big questions about statecraft, big questions about what does it mean to be a European, big questions about how things like diplomacy actually work, how policy actually works, how archives actually work, which Beale allows us windows into. So if you don't mind, what I want to do for a little while is just ask you some big questions that have some commentary, give you an opportunity to answer them, and then turn that over. I will try not to ask all of the ones that I've written down because I probably have too many. But I want to start first with this sort of question of the archive and the changing nature of the archive. I mean, you're clearly looking at a man here who is self-consciously creating his own archive as he goes, knowledge really being power in a fundamental way for him, also his income, right? His ability to have this knowledge is his economic stability. But there are these moments of also where he's writing an archive for self-legitimization, There's moments where he's doing it to, if you'll excuse the phrase, cover his ass, right? Where he's trying to make sure that he's making sure that he has a record, that he is doing things properly so he can't get in trouble. And also high anxiety, right? The archive is the solution to anxiety for him. Archive is a way of making sure that everything is covered, that he's giving the best advice, but also so that he can recall it if he gets into, because he's living in this sort of era of difficulty. And I found myself reflecting on the kind that it's a kind of, it's almost a backstage movie, right? So Hollywood loves making movies about actors, movies about movies. The stage play, the theater loves making backstage dramas because it's the world they know. And it strikes me that he really is a historian's biographical subject. That he is like, he's the archivist's archivist. And we ourselves are constantly, as we are writing, as we are doing something like crafting a biography, creating our own archives, just like Beale was, for our own legitimization, to keep ourselves from anxiety, to keep ourselves from when that reviewer says that thing, we can point to our footnote that we have in order to say like, haha, you didn't read closely enough, right? We are doing the same thing that Beale is doing. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more, you touched on this briefly, about how Beale's archival practice shaped your own archival practice as a historian. When you draw the line of when to quit, which is always the question for biography, when do you stop? And also, what does it mean to be an Elizabethan historian, right? What does it mean to be at this sort of interesting phase where things are starting to be both written down and recorded, but there are these frustrating gaps, much, much deeper than there would be a century before, but much, much more accessibility than there would be a century earlier. So I was hoping you could reflect on that for us for a moment.
You weren't kidding with big questions, Lucy. Well, the first one about Beale as the like the historian's historian or the archivist's archivist, 100%. I mean, he says or rather he writes it at multiple points how important it is to know one's histories, and he cites frequently various histories. He also legal history. He's really big into the documentary record, and so recognizing that he is dependent upon the documentary record for reading histories of other places, he creates then his own documentary record itself, to which then he can refer. And you mentioned, Lucy, ass covering. Oh, there's a lot of that in the book. No, not in the book, but in his life. But it's that paralyzing sense of insecurity that he always has with him, and his archive of religious and political affairs of his own life in some respects, that is his security blanket. And he refers at multiple points, he's like, oh, and by the way, I have all the records to back up this point if you want to come over and see them. And so the nature of his archive is it's very private, and it's not supposed to be for state purposes. That is not its origin or purpose. And rather famously later in life, he writes a discourse on the office of the principal secretary, and he makes a very specific point about how there are state archives and there are private papers, and these things should be kept separately. Now, he didn't actually he didn't follow his own advice because he kept plenty of state papers anyway. But I see your point, and you have a very good point about the nature of his archive as almost like a private experiment happens in the second half of the 16th century in a way that it would not have happened necessarily in the early 16th or later into the, say, mid 17th or late 17th, by which time the state has a much stronger apparatus, not only within England, but then across Europe, looking at Spanish archives, looking at German principalities, looking at the French archives, In this respect, the English State Archive is considerably behind other European states. And so what Beale's doing is very, very different. You also raised the question about the gaps. How far do you go down a rabbit hole? Well, either because I'm a very, very good historian or because I'm just stubborn like a rat, I went as far as I possibly could. I went basically until I could go no further, and then try to triangulate. That was the word you used before, Lucy. Try to use information that I had seen elsewhere to try to color in some gaps, but then to fill in some gaps rather. But then again, at the same time, I also admit when I don't know. And I'm very, very careful in my language, in my prose in the book, because I hate really, really cagey language. So I try to be as forceful as the evidence allows me to go, but at the same time, every once in a while I use a probably, or it seems likely that, and I don't like doing that, but every once in a while I needed to. So the gaps in the historical record, I mean, they will always be there for every period, for every place, for every issue. But I've tried to narrow those gaps, let's say, as much as I could by way of the archival work, which is that low and slow cooking again.
Yeah, I mean, that thing that you say, sort of interestingly, that they figured it out how to do this by the end of the 17th century. It's why I love studying Elizabethan history. For me, it's a laboratory, right? It's this period of laboratory and experimentation where they're figuring out, and by the end of it, a lot of these things have solidified, at least in its basic ways, and they're figuring it out. But a lot of the catalysts are happening during this, including these questions of, what really is the state? What's the relationship between the individual and the state, the individual actors in the state? These things are solidifying through Beale in really interesting ways. I actually want to talk about another way that he feels kind of Elizabethan to me in an interesting way, or an Elizabethan question, perhaps. Sorry, did you want to say something, David?
A quick plug, though, for Nick Popper's book, The Spectre of the Archive.
Oh, yeah.
Nick Popper's book, he was finishing it as I was finishing mine. I was able to see the first chapter of his book before it went to press. And so for those of you who are interested in the genesis, the process of particularly state archival practice in the late 16th and early 17th, then Nick Popper's book, University of Chicago Press.
Yeah, it's right. And you see it in a lot of ways. Like the ways that I'm particularly interested in our questions are much more sort of, again, sort of social history questions. You're seeing it in sort of experimentations in poor relief, experimentations in immigration reform, all these different things. But you see it here too in ways that are I think, exciting and really interesting. So my next question is it's a generational one. So one of the things about this book is it's the right season to be having this conversation. This book feels kind of autumnal to me in some interesting ways. Like Henry VII, in some ways, I imagine Beale as middle-aged from like the age of about 15 on. Like my imagination of Beale in my head is of somebody much older than he actually is. And I think that's for a few reasons. I think it's partially his personality. It's partially that his voice always, and whether he's sort of putting on maturity that he doesn't have or not, his voice really early on starts to sound middle-aged. But the other thing is that he is weirdly young for a lot of the moments that are happening within his story. So we talk a lot, for example, about Marian exiles, but we tend to talk about people who were exiles who made that decision themselves, right? Even in their early 20s to early 30s, they make the decision themselves. He's a tween almost when he becomes an exile. He's born in 41. He's slightly too early. Right? All of the big names that you're talking about are people who are 10, 15, 20 years older than he is. Those are the people who are his patrons, but they're also the people he's really close to. When you look at someone like Walsingham, right? Walsingham is what, 15 years older than him, give or take, 10, 15 years older than him. And he is taking his same life beats alongside Walsingham, but he's just a decade behind. And one of the things that is one of the ways this is resonant to me is you argue over and over again in the book that he's held back from the highest of office for a few reasons. And these reasons include, but are not limited to, the role that he plays, sort of controversial early role in debates about the succession, which sort of haunt him as he goes. Sort of a social conservatism, particularly around the increase in the importance of a university degree for non-titled people and the fact that he doesn't have it, which ends up sort of, he thinks, holding him back in a lot of ways. I would argue potentially his personality. The man has never met an opportunity to whine about gout that he does not take advantage of. He doesn't seem like a fun guy. But you also say at various points, right, that he's being held back, and that like Elizabeth never warms to him. She never really includes him on her top tier of gift giving. She doesn't look out for him in particular ways. And one of the things that occurs to me is that it's not merely about his social conservatism or his controversial early start or even his personality, but that he waited too long, that he's too European. And what really struck me about him is that he doesn't come back. He doesn't come back, right? So when she comes to the throne, a lot of the people who end up being his kind of contemporaries and important in European affairs, like Killigrew goes back, and then he's sent back out again. Walsingham comes back, and he ends up being an MP in the 1560s, a sort of a decade before Beale does, not just because he's older, but because he's back. And a lot of people, again, get sent back out again. And it strikes me that the people who Elizabeth is closest to, the people she trusts the most, the people that she allows forgiveness for things like meddling in succession conversation, are people who are there for her in the years where it's most tenuous, when the reign is really gelling. Between, even if they're not back right away, but they're back by the mid-1560s, they're fighting. He doesn't come back until she is pretty firmly settled, until a lot of, she doesn't come back until after the Northern Rebellion, right? Like, a lot of things have been really figured out by the time he's back. And so it occurs to me that, like, his desire to, and his decision to bounce around Germany and Paris and become this skilled figure and not come back until he's 30 is both simultaneously his greatest asset, right? It's the thing that he has to sell throughout his life, is his knowledge of these things, but actually fundamentally undermines him in a political way, because he is too European, because he doesn't have that connection to those early years. And I was wondering if you could reflect upon that a little bit, the ways in which his choices in his 20s sort of set him up actually to be on the outside of a lot of things rather than on the inside simultaneously. So there's this paradox, right? It simultaneously sets him up to be on the inside of conversations, but he's on the outside of power structures, I think, partially because he is not there for this crucial decade and a half almost.
Agreed. I suppose is how I start with that. But I think his decision, so like many of those who fled England during the reign of Mary did so for religious reasons, right? So the Marian exiles. Most of those we know about. The vast majority of those we know about are adults. They come up in the records. They leave records. He's an adolescent, and he does not go with immediate family. He has only loose protection through his uncle. And then through a circle of associates around the English community at Strasbourg, and then later at Zurich. But I think the most important thing, that the decision either he makes or is made for him, I can't tell, that changes his life forever, is that he doesn't come rushing back to England when Mary dies. And he's one of very few who do this. And I suppose then one needs to think about why. Why does he not come rushing back? And I think part of that answer needs to lie in the fact that he didn't have any firm family links that would have been able to support him with genuine security. His step-uncle John Hales would have been able to provide something, but then Hales gets into trouble because of the succession. And so there wasn't any guarantee of reliable support for him, either within his own immediate family or otherwise, because he had actually burned bridges with, at the very least, his most immediate tutor, John Aylmer, in Zurich, if not before. And so I think, going back to a previous point you make there, Lucy, his personality may have had something to do with it. He admits at one point that his nature is perhaps too brusque and plain, or complain. He was a complainer, and he was bristly, and I think he knew that. And so his decision not to go back to England does keep him something as an outsider. I think you're right. But I think then in some respects, on the other hand, he may have become increasingly comfortable in the Holy Roman Empire. I think that by 1561-2, by that time, he had been in Heidelberg, he had been at Wittenberg, he had learned at the seats of Protestant citadels, and he thought in German, he thought in Latin, he thought in English, and so I think that his own level of comfort was actually in the empire, because that's where he grew up.
Yeah.
As an adolescent. And I think that generational point is actually very, very important. That he went there as an adolescent, but without a parent.
Yeah.
A parent who would then take him back. And so that left him perhaps a little bit listless in some ways. And when he ends up taking a job for the Earl of Hertford to try to establish a degree of legitimacy for marriage, and then there are Protestant succession claims here, he gets into massive trouble, but he didn't know that he was going to get into trouble for that. And so when then he gets into trouble for that in 63, he realizes it's probably best that I stay overseas. So I think that decision in late 58, 59 to stay, and then a decision in 63, I better stay here and just do whatever I can to make a wage. That is
but continuing to stay, right, staying through 67, through 69, by the time he's already made those connections with Cecil and is saying things like, look, you're my only friend, like he's still staying. So it's because he could have gone back and thrown himself at Cecil's feet in some interesting ways, and he doesn't do that. So I think it's really, I want to ask one more question, then I really want to open it up to everybody, and which is just that he really is this kind of hard nut to crack in a lot of ways, and I think that's partially because he is a man of a lot of paradoxes. So simultaneously, right, Europeanism being both his greatest strength, but in some ways potentially one of his weaknesses. He has a series of Pyrrhic victories. I think his victory over Mary Queen of Scots is absolutely a Pyrrhic victory. Like, he wins, but like there's no longer this common enemy uniting him. It actually gets rid of a lot of his usefulness. He is like, it's actually kind of bad. But one of the things and you can see this he doesn't love torture, but he's also involved in interrogating Campion, like all of these sort of interesting paradoxes. But the one that really gets me over and over and over again is that he is a man who is all about the state and the strength of the state and the importance of the state and the importance of England within this sort of pan-Protestant European framework, and like even being at the vanguard of that. But he's also constantly trying to limit the powers of the state through principle. And I find that really interesting. He does it over questions of conscience with Whitgift, right? When he's willing to say, look, there are limits to what the state church should be able to do in terms of conscience. When he says that the state church, etc., that really it's Parliament that should be having power here, not the bishops. He does it when he's talking about the proposed murder of Mary Queen of Scots, which would have actually solved a lot of problems. And he says really explicitly, I actually wrote this line down because I thought it was a very important one when you say this, that like he talks about the, let's see if I can find it. It's a really good line. That history and law, precedent and procedure were supreme. You write, that's what you write, that history and law and precedent and procedure are more important than exigency for the state causes. So I was wondering, like, I suppose if you could just very quickly reflect on that before we have some wonderful questions in the chat, and I do want to give this an opportunity, but if you could take a couple minutes and reflect on this sort of these paradoxes at the heart of him, and whether maybe he's just a little too nuanced or a little too principled to actually succeed within the Elizabethan world, and that's why he's so bitter.
Bitter. A historian of the 17th century actually referred to him as a most austere and bitter man. The short answer to all of that is, I think that paradox between the strength of the state, but then also the seeming limits of the state, is one of the reasons why Patrick Collinson was fascinated or stood in awe of Beale, and why he advocated for the monarchical republic, the monarchical republic. That I think in Beale we can see the strength of the state is in Parliament, and we can see the strength of the state most certainly in the monarch as well. It's not an either or, but for him and for other monarchical Republicans, he would see it not as a paradox, but as a healthy state run well in consultation. So not necessarily limited, but naturally, Her Majesty has her prerogatives. But at the same time, the Commons have their roles as well. And what does he use to advocate for the rights and privileges of the Commons? History. And so for him, it's going back to history. It's going back to precedent. It's going back to records. In some respects, he goes back to Magna Carta.
Yeah. He's no, I mean, I'm not going to sit around calling him a proto Whig, but he has some tendencies. He has some tendencies. But I mean, it's fascinating to me that with that being said, he puts his energies and efforts not behind his role as MP or trying to become a leader within Parliament or within that sphere. He puts it very much outside of that, right? That when push comes to shove, he makes his bones like outside of that sphere. And so it's interesting to me that he's simultaneously doing those two things. Obviously, he is an MP. But we have a lot of questions, and I want to have an opportunity to ask them. I don't know if this is for me to... Bob, do you want to go? And then we have a question from Jordan and a couple questions from Jenny in the thing. Hey, Bob.
Thank you very much. Hello to you all. Lucy, wonderful to see you. David Gehring, I have not read the book, I'm sorry to say, though I'm certainly motivated to do so now, but I just wanted to put this in what seems to me some kind of historiographical perspective. Voice from an older generation, if you will. I'm about to celebrate my 82nd birthday here pretty soon. It seems to me that the writing of Elizabethan biography has gone through three definable. You have brought it to a third definable stage in what sounds like a wonderful book. The early efforts of people like Conyers Reed, almost a century ago, writing the mammoth biographies of Cecil and Walsingham in multi-volumes, without access to anywhere near the kind of documentation, indeed, that you've been privileged to access. And then in my generation of people who came along in the 1960s and 70s, for whom writing an historical biography of an Elizabethan Privy Councillor was almost a de rigueur thesis subject. And so, you know, many of us did that. And by, I would say, 1980, there were very few Elizabethan Privy Councillors who had yet been served or disserved, if you will, by that kind of effort. And that incidentally motivated an early and long-standing effort to write a biography of Beale, of which you may or may not be aware. This was by the former student of Sir John Neal, Joan Henderson, who had done her MA thesis with Neal and then worked for him on the History of Parliament Trust when Joan, who was a wonderful woman in many ways and very much the soul of the Institute of Historical Research without ever being employed by it, she worked in retirement for many, many years on Beale without access to the documents there, without, I think, access to some of the languages that you can employ. But it seems to me, from what you and Lucy have so eloquently sketched out, that you've brought Elizabethan biography to an entirely new and I think wondrous dimension in which you have engaged with continental literatures and continental experiences. And indeed, you have produced a slow-cooked product. I congratulate you, and I look forward to reading this when I get to it. Thank you.
Incredibly generous of you, Bob. Thank
not
you.
At all.
Particularly sight unseen.
Yes, well.
But I take your point about Conyers Reed's works and Jones. I mean,
Norm Jones, yeah, of course, who has looked at Beale as well, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Joan Henderson's entry for History of Parliament,
yes.
I mean, it is absolutely fantastic. And in some respects, I think that it digs more deeply than the current ODNB article. It's more than complimentary, let's put it that way.
When Joan Henderson, who taught as a schoolboy Sir Roy Strong, when Sir Roy Strong was knighted by the Queen, he was allowed one guest. He brought Joan Henderson to the palace.
And I mean, but one of the things that so in writing on Beale, I've essentially had three other historians in my mind. One was Joan Henderson, another was Patrick Collinson, another was Mark Taverner, who wrote the thesis on Beale. And I've been in correspondence with Mark for a while now. He left history a long time ago, but you can find him on the interwebs. And it turned out that we had very, very different motivations, let's say. And he paid attention to certain things, and I paid attention to other things, to say the least. And so I always had them kind of in the back of my mind, let's say, that I need to, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, how much farther can I see? And I think that maybe that brings me to your broader point, that there's maybe a third stage in biography, because I'm painfully aware that we have access to material now that people even 10 or 15 years ago could have only dreamed of. And one of the things that I was very, very grateful for, I mean, obviously, back up, the pandemic was awful in just about every conceivable way. But one of the things for which I'm very grateful is that archivists kept working. And archivists made a lot of their material available to us electronically on request, and sometimes within a matter of hours, and for free. And so I could get so much more material from Norwich City Library, for the sake of example, very, very quickly. And so I think, Bob, the key element here is access to archives and willingness to take it slowly. And I think that, Lucy, this goes back to a point you made, that there's so much pressure on us to produce that you just need to make it fast. Just crack it out. And I simply refused. I even told my own research directors in my department, like, no, it'll be done when I'm done. And okay, we'll just make sure it's good. Okay. So I think that's a very nice way to put it, Bob, about there's maybe a third generation or a third opportunity maybe at biography now that we are simply fortunate if we're willing to put in the work and put in the time. Because otherwise, I mean, it'd be easy enough just to rely on calendars, state papers, foreign, but what fun is that?
I'm going to ask a question that Jordan asked in the queue, and then when Jenny asked, the question for the queue was, I really love your points about the archival anxieties surrounding Beale and his work. Do you go into how he was received into subsequent centuries? As you're discussing monarchical republics, for example, do you look forward into how he was received?
I do briefly. In the 17th century, he is received, let's say, negatively. He was noted as a complainer, as bitter, as austere, as a Puritan, somebody who argued with Whitgift. And so he wasn't seen in a particularly positive light. And I think that Fuller's history, I mean, Camden starts it in the early 17th, and then Fuller continues it, Peter Heylin continues it, this is into the mid 17th century. And I think in some respects, those characterizations of a bitter, unhappy Puritan actually color the impression of Beale well into the early 20th century with the original DNB entry, the original Dictionary of National Biography entry. There's still a little bit of that, the long tail of Heylin, let's say, in the original DNB entry. And you can also see it in the Life and Acts of Whitgift. You can see it in Stripe. Beale is very adversarial in a lot of respects. So, Jordan, it's a great question, and I've traced it insofar as I've been able, but it's good food for thought. Thank you for raising it.
Jenny has several questions, but I just want to ask one quick one, which is because it's the one I'm most excited for you to talk about, which is she asked, was he on board with finding recusants? So if you could talk sort of quickly about the limits to which Beale is willing to enforce conformity and uniformity on non-Protestants within England would be great.
Yes, law exists to be enforced, and he would say that anyone found breaking the law should be punished accordingly. They should pay their fine, but so long as a Catholic is willing to pay their fine, and so long as that Catholic is not looking to overturn the state, you're fine. And so for him, he makes a distinction between those Catholics who are obedient to the state and those Catholics who are looking to assassinate the Queen. And even those, that latter, those looking to assassinate the Queen, in his interrogations of Campion, in his many, many dealings with Mary Queen of Scots, he opposes the use of torture. He does not see torture as he would put it, an English thing to do. He would see it as torture as compromising the nature of an investigation, because any testimony given under torture cannot necessarily be taken as real evidence. And so he's very rigorous when it comes to his application of the law and his sensibilities in the law. But then when it comes to Catholics in England, it's about whether they can still be considered loyal subjects. Does that make sense for you there, Jenny? I'm seeing a little bit of a head nod. Okay.
Yes, yes. And, Elizabeth herself said, I don't want to make windows into men's souls.
And he's happy for people to pay the fine.
Thanks. I mean, I was fascinated by your statement that he opposed torture, that he thought it was un-English. I mean, I thought nobody in the early modern period opposed torture.
I think that if we look, we might find more. And it's un-English. It doesn't. It's cruel. It's barbaric. But then also on a legal sense, you can't trust it. So I wouldn't say that he's some sort of proto-humanitarian in any 20th or 21st century sense. But it's interesting that he sees it as both cruel, un-English, uncivilized, one might say even, but then also unreliable. That there should be other ways to get your evidence, one might say.
I imagine that actually spending quite a lot of time on the continent when there's quite a lot of torture, both public and judicial, in order to get answers out, does rather probably put into effect the limits to that. Also, of course, it's a way of establishing yourself as not Catholic, right? We're not like these people. That's what they do, right? It's a sort of it's a pretty easy way of establishing yourself as somehow morally justified for all sorts of other behaviors if you can say you're morally justified in this behavior.
Yeah, I was on the tip of my tongue was that Beale is not the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
So there is a certain moral high ground implied there that we are not the Inquisition. We are not going to be racking people. We shouldn't be racking people or using the strappado. Although naturally it happens. He's not in favor of it.
I think that's time. I think it's an hour she flies, especially when there's so much to talk about. So, but before, I mean, I know you're going to wrap things up. I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to allow me to talk about this with you. It was genuinely fun.
And the pleasure was entirely mine. You actually, you read the book. Like, I have an audience of one. Like, what more can a historian want?
Yes, I have to say thank you guys so much for such a wonderful conversation. This was excellent. And I hope that, you know, everyone will join me in thanking Lucy and David today. And yeah, hopefully you'll tune in for more of our events. And also for those interested, David, you mentioned the Nick Popper. He did an event with us also. So there is a recording of that up on our site if anyone wants to check it out.
Last thing, Amanda, I circulated a flyer to you that you said that you can send around to folks as well.
Yep, to everyone that registered, I will send out the flyer for the book.
Super.
So yeah, keep an eye out on your inbox for that. And then everyone please join me in thanking David and Lucy.
Thanks so much.
Have a good day, gang.